Hello students, my name is Sir Mohammed. Today I will be with Form 3 students in the subject called history. And our today's topic is colonial social services. I hope you will enjoy the lesson. These colonial social services is the fourth topic of history in Form 3. Colonial social services is the fourth topic of history in Form 3. In this topic, we are going to discuss about three major social services introduced in Africa by the colonialists. The first social service introduced by colonialists in Africa was colonial education. Also, we are going to discuss about colonial health services as the second social services introduced in Africa. In the last part, or the last service introduced by the whites in Africa, was colonial water and housing services. Are we together? Yes. Today, we are going to start this topic by discussing the colonial education. But before proceeding or going to the colonial education, let us define the terms colonial social services. What is colonial social services? Who can try to define colonial social services? Yes, colonial social services were the services introduced by the colonialists. Purposely to accelerate exploitation and improve the welfare of colonial civil servants during colonial era. So if we are asked about colonial social services, we can define as services provided by the colonialists purposely to accelerate exploitation and improve the welfare of colonial civil servants during colonial era. So, colonial social services. Now let us see the meaning of colonial social services. Refer to the services introduced or provided by the colonialists purposely to accelerate exploitation and improve the welfare of colonial civil servants during colonial era. during colonial era. The whites or colonialists in Africa introduced colonial education. One of the examples of colonial social services introduced in Africa was colonial education. So we have colonial education as one of the services introduced. Colonial education. Also, we have colonial health. Colonial health services. And water and housing services. These were the major colonial social services introduced in Africa. Also, the whites introduced colonial transport systems or transportation services and electricity services. But today, we are going to discuss, or we are going to look at the colonial education as our today's lesson. Are we together? Okay? So, our today's lesson will base on colonial education. Colonial education. Students say colonial education. Good. Colonial education. This will be our first colonial social services to discuss. Colonial education. Who can try to define the term colonial education? Student, who can try to define colonial education? Yes, who can try? Yuma, can you try to define colonial education? Yes. The term colonial education can be defined as the term colonial education refers to the service. Colonial education refers to the type of education, refers to the type of education introduced by colonialists to consolidate, introduced by the colonialists to consolidate and accelerate the exploitation. Accelerate what? Accelerate the exploitation of Africans through ideological means. So this is a simple definition or meaning of colonial education. A simple definition of colonial education. So when we are asked about the meaning of colonial education, simply we can define as the type of education introduced by the colonialists to consolidate and accelerate the exploitation of Africans through ideological means. Are we together? Yes. So, the form of education we have currently in Tanzania and almost all African nations has been inherited from colonial education system. Even in Tanzania, the education system we are having, though has been amended or reformed, but the system is looked to be like colonial education system. So this is our first colonial social services, which we are discussing today. In this colonial education, we are going to discuss about objectives of colonial education. What were the objectives of colonial education? Why the whites decided to introduce education in Africa? Is this type of education introduced to benefit Africans? Or was it introduced to benefit the whites? So all the questions are going to be answered by the objectives of colonial education. What were the reasons behind introduction of colonial education? Dear student, I hope we are together. Is there anyone who can mention or who can tell us one objective of colonial education? Is there anyone who can tell us one objective? Yes, good. Objectives of colonial education. Objectives of colonial education. Now let us see the objectives of colonial education. As our fellow says, one of the objectives of colonial education was to train the African manpower. To train the African manpower. The whites introduced colonial education in Africa aiming at getting subordinates or aiming at getting assistants. As we know, the number of the whites in Africa or who came in Africa for colonialism or during colonial era was very few compared to the number of the colonies or compared to the nature of the colonies. So the whites decided to impart knowledges to the Africans, very few Africans, in order to get subordinates or to get assistants. These assistants were the Africans who acquired colonial education and worked alongside colonial masters in performing some activities in Africa. So one of the objectives of colonial education was to train African manpower. To train African manpower. These Africans who attained, as we say, attained colonial education, worked alongside, helped the whites in performing some duties in Africa. And the positions that held by some Africans during colonial era were clerks. There were Africans who worked as clerks. Also, there were Africans who worked as messengers or office attendants. Also, there were Africans who worked as primary school teachers. All these Africans worked alongside colonial masters to help the whites in performing their daily activities. So this is one of the objectives of colonial education. Another objective is to divide Africans. Another objective is to divide Africans. Why to divide Africans? Who can tell us why colonial education aimed to divide Africans? Why colonial education aimed at dividing Africans? Who can tell us? Yes? Okay? Colonial education also intended to divide the Africans into two classes. Simply as people say, when you want to rule or to control the people, you are required to divide them into classes. When you divide the people, it will be very easier to control or to rule them. That's why the whites used this principle of divide and rule by providing colonial education. So they provided colonial education in order to divide Africans, And they succeeded. These whites were succeeded in dividing the Africans into classes. During colonial era, there was a class of the elites. They divided Africans into two classes: educated Africans and uneducated Africans, or elites and illiterates. We can say also elites and illiterates. These two classes were used by the whites to rule the Africans. The Africans who got colonial education as educated Africans were used by the whites to control their fellow Africans who were illiterate or who did not acquire colonial education. So one of the objectives of colonial education was to divide Africans, or to divide the Africans. I hope we're together. Another objective is to facilitate raw materials production. To facilitate raw materials production. Raw materials was one of the economic reasons or demands of the whites. One of the reasons for the establishment of colonialism in Africa was to get raw materials. How could Africa produce? How could Africa engage in production of those demanded raw materials by Europeans? How could Africans engage in production of raw materials, which were very, very important in European industries? That's why the whites decided to introduce the so-called colonial education to the Africans in order to get raw materials. Various agricultural skills were instilled to the Africans. Various production techniques and skills were taught to the Africans. All these were provided to the Africans or were instilled to the Africans, aiming at getting Africans who could be able to engage in production of raw materials. So one of the objectives was to facilitate raw materials, to facilitate raw materials production, to facilitate raw materials production. These raw materials production, we mean minerals, agricultural produce, like cotton, sisal, and other agricultural products which were introduced by the whites. Okay? Let us proceed. Let us proceed with our lesson by looking another objective of colonial education. Why the whites introduced colonial education? Another objective was to spread European culture, to spread European culture. As we know, culture can be defined as total ways of life. And one of the aspects of culture is language. So the whites introduced colonial education in Africa in order to spread European culture. And one of the aspects of European culture we have currently is these foreign languages we have in Africa. For example, in Tanzania and Kenya, we have English language as one of the medium of instructions in schools. This is one of the impact of, or is one of the result of colonial education. So the colonial education introduced in Africa by the whites aiming at spreading European culture, spreading European culture. Here we mean introduction of foreign language, introduction of foreign languages like English language. We have French, we have Portuguese language, and other foreign languages introduced in Africa by the whites. Are we together? Is there anyone who have question or an opinion before proceeding? Okay, no one. Okay, let us continue with these objectives of colonial education. Another objective was to break the African informal education, to break the African informal education, to break Africans' informal education. This African informal education was the type of education existed or practiced in Africa before the coming of the whites. And this education was one of the best education in Africa because it was more practical and connected to the environment. But the introduction of colonial education, which was formal, aimed at breaking the African informal education. This African informal education, nowadays we have that system. As we have been taught, or we are always being taught by our elders at home, grandmothers, fathers, teach us how to survive, how to cultivate, how to cook, this is one of the systems used at home and other places in Africa. The Africans, children are being taught how to engage in various life skills, in various activities. But the whites came with their education in Africa, aiming at ensuring this type of informal education, or this type of education in Africa, is no longer existing. It's no longer existing. That's why currently we have people, we have Africans who do not know how to dig, do not know how to fish, do not know how to cook. But they are educated people. They are educated people. So we have this objective. The last objective is to instill obedience and discipline, to instill obedience and discipline. Also, this was one of the objectives of colonial education. The Africans, before the coming of colonialism, were seen as uncivilized people. That's why the whites came with the education to instill obedience, to instill discipline to the Africans. So these were the objectives of colonial education. I hope you have understood, and you are now able, when you find a question, explain the objectives of colonial education, you can be able to attempt such question by describing or explaining these objectives as we have discussed today. There any question? No one? Okay, dear student, I hope you have understood our today's lesson, and let us mark this is the end of our today's lesson. It is your time now to revise what we have discussed today, and then do the following exercise. I give you an exercise to do. Do this exercise. Explain the objectives of colonial education, the objectives of colonial education introduced in Africa, introduced in Africa. So you are going to do this exercise by attempting that question. Says, explain the objectives of colonial education introduced in Africa. I wish you all the best. See you next time. Goodbye.